folks. I was looking through my YouTube channel and found that it is nearly 3 years since I last posted a video on my military beer stein collection. I think it would make an interesting video to see how I go about finding worthy steins to add to my collection and take you right from the initial search to the stein's arrival at my home. Once the stein arrives, we'll go over the story in military history the stein represents. So with no further ado, let's get started. It is my experience that I have found the most success in finding the military beer steins I want on eBay. So let's head there. In the search box, I'll type in German military beer steins. There are a great number of steins up for sale on eBay for a wide range of prices. I'm looking for steins in the $50 to $100 Canadian range. One thing you must always bear in mind when buying an item on eBay is that a seller can charge whatever price they see fit, but the actual value of the item is what someone is willing to pay for it. A lot of eBay sellers think they have gold for sale, such as this fellow looking for $2,036 for his stein. Maybe it is worth that amount, but it is way out of my price range and is too high a risk should the stein later turn out to only be worth $50 to $100. So I'm going to scroll right on by it and not even look at it. Here's a candidate that is still out of my price range, but worth taking a look at. There are some very intriguing things about this beer stein that caught my attention. The stein is described as an authentic, antique, 1904 German regimental beer stein, and there are a number of things in the photos and descriptions that indicate this just might be true. Let's start with the photo of the pewter lid. As pewter ages over the decades, it turns a dull grayish brown color due to exposure to the air. However, the pewter lid normally remains closed and the underside of the lid is not exposed to the air. Thus, it remains the bright, shiny silver of new pewter. The German pottery companies tried to replicate this aging on their reproductions of regimental beer steins by chemically treating their pewter lids. However, this turns the lid black instead of the natural dull brownish gray, and even the underside of the lid is black instead of the bright, shiny silver of naturally aged pewter. Next up, we will turn our attention to the photo of the handle for this beer stein, which is smooth as it should be for a stein that is nearly 120 years old. Reproduction steins quite often have a stylized bump on the handle, which is a modern feature that was not used before World War I. Now we will turn our attention to the photo of the underside of the base, which shows it is unmarked. The original German regimental beer steins were sold domestically and were not meant for export, and thus were never marked. Now we head to the photo of the lithopane of this beer stein, showing a soldier with his sweetie. The German pottery companies did use this lithopane on some of their reproduction steins, but in the original, the soldier's leg is straight, and in the reproduction ones, his leg is bent. The photo for this stein shows a soldier with a straight leg. As part of the paperwork included with this stein is a letter from a German language newspaper where the owner of the stein got an English translation of the German text on the stein. The letter is dated 1954, 9 years after the conclusion of World War II, and the stein is further described as a barn find. All of these indicators point out to me that this German regimental beer stein very well could have been acquired by an American GI in Germany very near the end of or just after World War II and put away and forgotten. This is the first time I have ever felt like I was looking at an original German regimental beer stein in an eBay entry. The seller's price of $250 US would not be out of line for an original German regimental beer stein, and if anything, might be a bit too low. I hope the seller gets their price. However, this is too much for me to afford at this time. I put this eBay entry on my watch list as I am very interested to see how this turns out, and maybe later I'll be in a financial position to buy this stein myself. Well, better get back to the search. And I think we got a winner. $38 Canadian sure puts it within my price range. The stein's title, Wellington's Encounter with Blücher at Waterloo, would give me a good excuse to research the Battle of Waterloo to add this tale to this video. In a photo of the base of the beer stein provided by the seller, there is a mark for Kaiser, West Germany, which is a German porcelain company that has been in business since 1872. This particular Kaiser mark was placed on porcelain items produced by the company between 1970 to 1990, which would make this beer stein between 54 to 34 years old. The seller's price of $28 US was reasonable, but they also included a best offer section as well. I'd disrespect my Scottish heritage if I didn't try for a lower price, but unfortunately my 5 offers were all rejected. Even so, I decided to go ahead and purchase the stein. The stein was located in Canton, Texas, and made its way to my home in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I wonder what that is. Oh, well, time to open the box and see what we got. Unfortunately, there looks to be a little bit of a dent in the box right there from shipping. Hopefully that doesn't mean the stein's going to be broken, but we'll find out. Oh, there's lots of bubble wrap and the little foam peanuts. That's always a good sign. Move the box to the side. And there we are. I see no signs of damage, so And so, here it is, my German beer stein that depicts an important event in the Battle of Waterloo. One side of the stein depicts a group of soldiers in the Allied army made up of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German units under the command of Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington. The opposite side of the spear stein depicts a British officer greeting an officer of the Prussian army as the Prussians arrive at Waterloo. And finally, in the most important central area of the beer stein is the two commanders, the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher, the commander of the Prussian army, meeting on the field of battle at Waterloo. What was so significant about this seemingly mundane meeting between the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blücher that convinced Kaiser Porcelain that it rated making a porcelain stein to commemorate it nearly a century and a half later? For this, we have to take a look at Europe in 1815 and the events leading up to the Battle of Waterloo. After his disastrous invasion of Russia that resulted in a major defeat, Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy, on the 11th of April, 1814. In his place, Louis XVIII was restored to the throne of France. This was not popular with a lot of the French population, who remembered the corrupt, arrogant kings they overthrew during the French Revolution a quarter century earlier. Thus, word was sent to Napoleon that if he could make his way back to France, there were those who would follow and assist him to return to power. Napoleon was defeated in 1814 by a coalition of Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Sardinia. Afterwards, even though these nations concentrated on dividing up the continent and recovering from the wars, at the Conference of Vienna, they were leery of Napoleon so close to France on Elba. There was talk among some of these nations of removing him from Elba and exiling him much further away to keep him out of trouble. Thus, if Napoleon was going to make an escape from Elba, time was running out. On the 26th of February, 1815, Napoleon and 1,150 followers snuck out of Elba and headed to France. Upon his return to France, Napoleon rapidly gained followers and was able to return to Paris and overthrow Louis XVIII, who fled France. Napoleon was back in power and tried to make peace with Britain and the other nations arrayed against him, but they would have none of it. It became clear that eventually they would attack to remove him. Napoleon needed to gain time to consolidate his power in France and rebuild the French army that had been severely weakened by the disastrous campaign in Russia. The armies of Russia and Austria were a considerable distance from France and would take time to mobilize against Napoleon. But much closer in Belgium were the Duke of Wellington, in charge of a mixed army of British, Dutch, and German troops, and Marshal Blücher at the head of the Prussian army. Combined, the armies under Wellington and Blücher far outnumbered Napoleon's forces, but individually they were similar in size to his army. Napoleon's strategy was to keep them from uniting and defeat them individually. Once they were out of the way, Napoleon planned to take Brussels and be in a far better position to consolidate his base in France and prepare to confront Russia and Austria. On the 16th of June, 1815, Napoleon went after Blücher near the town of Ligny. The battle was a tactical victory for the French, but the bulk of the Prussian army survived and was reinforced by Prussian troops who had not fought that day. At one point in the battle, Blücher's horse was shot out from under him and fell upon him. The 72-year-old Blücher was injured but recovered enough to lead his troops to join Wellington at Waterloo 2 days later. In the meantime, Wellington headed towards his chosen ground for his confrontation with Napoleon at Waterloo. On the day before the battle, and throughout the night until morning, Waterloo experienced a torrential rainstorm, leaving the battlefield completely drenched. This was bad news for Napoleon, as he needed to be able to move men, cannon, and horses about as needed without them being stuck in the mud. He was therefore forced to wait until 11 a.m. to allow the field to dry before starting his attack, a delay he could ill afford, as he needed to defeat the Duke of Wellington before Blücher's Prussian army arrived to reinforce him. The Duke of Wellington chose his battlefield wisely. There was a ridgeline along the entire length of the area, where Wellington situated his troops on the reverse slope out of direct cannon and musket fire. To advance on his position, the French had to climb a steep slope where they could be fired upon from the high ground. In addition, Wellington fortified 3 farmsteads before the ridge. Napoleon began the battle between 10:30 to 11:30 in the morning with an attack on the farmstead at Hougoumont, meant as a diversion to have Wellington move troops from his central position, weakening it before the main assault. However, the French became obsessed with this attack and continued it throughout the afternoon and poured more and more men and resources into this assault that was initially meant as a distraction. At one point, the French broke into the yard, but the defending troops managed to close the gates again and slaughter the French troops who got trapped inside. Wellington later said this was a key factor in his victory at Waterloo, as the French lost so much time that they didn't have in this assault, thus allowing Blücher's Prussians time to get to Waterloo. Around noon, Napoleon's artillery battery of 80 cannon opened fire on Wellington's central position. Most of Wellington's troops were deployed on the reverse slope of the ridgeline out of direct fire. The mud worked in Wellington's favor this day, as many of the exploding projectiles buried themselves in the mud before exploding, muffling their effect and containing the shrapnel. But even so, a large number of casualties resulted from the bombardment. At approximately 1 p.m., the French infantry began its assault on the center of Wellington's position on the ridge. The British infantry and cannon, who had been positioned on the reverse slope of the ridge, stood up and laid down withering fire on the approaching French infantry that had to advance up a steep slope, resulting in great casualties among the French troops. Even so, the British line began to falter. At this point, 2 brigades of British heavy cavalry, who had been deployed unseen behind the ridge, charged downhill into the French, taking pressure off of the strained infantry on the ridgeline. The British cavalry succeeded in halting the French advance and captured the Eagle Standard of the French 45th Regiment of the Line, but were then engaged by the French cavalry, who almost wiped them out, forcing the surviving British cavalry to withdraw. At 4 p.m., Marshal, Napoleon's second in command, observed Wellington's troops moving the wounded to the rear, that he mistook as the beginning of a retreat. Hoping to capitalize on this, he led a cavalry charge to turn the retreat into a rout of Wellington's forces. But instead of coming across a defeated enemy withdrawing from the field, Ney's cavalry fell upon a well-disciplined force who had formed squares 4 ranks deep. The cavalry was unable to penetrate the squares and took continuous musket fire, suffering enormous casualties. Blücher's Prussian army began to arrive in force, attacking Napoleon's right flank. At 7:30 in the evening, in a final desperate bid to turn the tide of battle, Napoleon ordered his final reserve, the heretofore undefeated Imperial Guard, to attack Wellington's forces. But by this time it was too late, and the Guard force too weak to do the job. Eventually, the Imperial Guard faltered and began to fall back. Seeing this, the remaining French troops panicked and turned the retreat into an irreversible rout of Napoleon's entire army. And so it was done. Napoleon abdicated for the second time and surrendered himself to the British, who exiled him to St. Helena, a small island in the mid-South Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, where he died on the 5th of May, 1821. And so we learned why this meeting between the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blücher was so important that Kaiser Porcelain considered it worthy of a commemorative Stein nearly a century and a half later. The Battle of Waterloo could have gone either way. Mistakes were made on both sides, but in the end, Wellington was able to hang on until Blücher arrived to assist him in defeating Napoleon. After Waterloo, Europe entered an era of relative peace, with only minor conflicts that didn't get out of hand for nearly 100 years until 1914 and World War I. In this time, Britain and France established large empires, and the various independent German states finally united to form Germany. The Industrial Revolution took hold and helped raise the standard of living for the whole world. I hope you've enjoyed this adventure of acquiring my new beer stein and the story of Waterloo it inspired. Until next time, everyone keep safe and well.